Sylvia Likens is a sorrowful tale. Torture and death were all that awaited her in Gertrude Baniszewski's house. This story brought me to tears and made my stomach turn. And I have a feeling it'll do the same to you. Welcome to Curious True Crime. Before we begin, I'd like to ask that you leave a like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and leave a comment down below. Thank you. So Sylvia's parents worked at a traveling carnival. Sylvia was one of 5 children, and it got to the point where the parents just really couldn't afford so many children anymore. That's why they were going with the circus, so they could make more money. Half of the children ended up going to their grandparents' house, and all that was left was Sylvia and Jenny. Well, the family ended up meeting a woman named Gertrude, and they thought, oh, well, she's a nice enough lady. Let's see if Sylvia and Jenny can stay with her. So the dad offers up $20 a week for Gertrude to take Sylvia and Jenny in. And she accepts because Gertrude herself is a mother of 7 children and is just as poor as the Likens family. Gertrude would even do chores for the neighborhood because she needed a way to get money other than child support. At this point in her life, Gertrude had been through, I think, 3 divorces, and in those relationships, she was abused, and at this time, she was on prescription medication for depression. Their first week in the new house, Sylvia and Jenny had a relatively good time. Everything seemed fine and normal. Other than Sylvia and Gertrude's daughter Paula butt heads, they didn't exactly get along very well. But other than that, everything seemed fine. Unfortunately, the next week, Sylvia's father ended up not paying the $20 on time. And this is where the story turns dark. Gertrude told the girls, and I quote, "I took care of you 2 bitches for a week, and this is what I get," end quote. She then took both Sylvia and Jenny and dragged them to a room. She left Jenny outside the room, and Jenny had to hear her sister's screams from the other side of the door. Unfortunately, this would only be the beginning of Sylvia's torture. And what's even worse is that the next day the father gave the money to Gertrude, but this still didn't satisfy her. She had now had a taste of what she could do to these girls, and nothing was going to stop her from continuing. So Sylvia and Jenny would receive regular beatings from Gertrude with paddles and belts. If Gertrude could not do it from being too weak or tired, her daughter Paula would step in and do it for her. Soon, they just focused all of the beatings on Sylvia, and they even made Jenny join, or they threatened her, saying that they would do even worse to her. So they forced Jenny to join the torture of Sylvia. For some reason, I think just because she could, Gertrude accused Sylvia of stealing from her and stealing in general, and she burnt her fingertips off. Then she took Sylvia to a church function where they had free hot dogs. She would force Sylvia to eat as many hot dogs as she possibly could until she vomited, and then to not waste food, Gertrude would then make Sylvia eat her own vomit. Gertrude would then encourage her children to join the torment and the torture of Sylvia. She would have the boys practice karate on her, so shoving her, kicking her, punching her, just over and over and over again. They would shove her to the ground and beat her on the ground, and it was just horrible. It was just a terrible time and just disgusting. Along with all of that, they would cut her skin and rub salt into her wounds. They would throw her down the stairs And to cleanse her of her sins, they would put her in scalding hot water, which makes no sense, but to Gertrude it did. They would also use Sylvia's skin as an ashtray and put out cigarettes on her regularly. Not only did Paula mutilate Sylvia's privates, but she also stomped on them and accused Sylvia of being pregnant, even though Paula herself was pregnant. So I'm not sure why that was a big deal to her and why she did any of that to Sylvia. That doesn't make any sense to me, considering she herself was pregnant. But that's what she did. She did that disturbing thing. Even Gertrude's son, John Jr., would come in and torment Sylvia. He was only 12 years old, and he would make Sylvia lick clean the soiled diapers of the youngest child, which is obviously disgusting and ew and just really disturbing, and especially for a 12-year-old. That doesn't make any sense to me that a 12-year-old would think of something like that. And maybe he didn't. Maybe Gertrude thought of it instead and just told him to do it, but the fact is that that's what they did, and it's disturbing. Sylvia was forced to get completely naked in front of Gertrude's entire family and shove multiple objects up her privates, including used Coke bottles. Because of all of the mutilation caused to her privates, it made it so she could not go to the bathroom correctly and on her own. So because of this, she would regularly wet the bed. And when this started to happen, Gertrude decided that she was no longer like the other children, that she was more like an animal because she couldn't control herself. So she threw her down the steps and locked her in the basement, which is horrendous because, hello, you're the one that did this to her. Like, you and your children are the ones that made it so she couldn't go to the bathroom by herself, and you're going to get mad at her for it? It doesn't make any sense, but this whole case doesn't make any sense as to why any of this was done. So, while in the basement, Sylvia wasn't allowed to be fed. They refused her food, and the only thing they allowed her to eat was crackers, which obviously you can't stay alive on just crackers for very long. That's ridiculous. But they would barely even give her that. And they would often torture her by pretending to give her food and then taking it away at the last second before she could actually eat it, because they thought it was funny, and it's disgusting. So at this point, Gertrude would make up just horrible stories about Sylvia and tell them to the neighborhood children, so that way they would come over and also torture Sylvia. Gertrude would tell them that Sylvia would say things about their parents or say things about their friends, and that was enough to get the kids to come over and beat her up, I guess. One teenage girl named Anna said eventually that Gertrude told her that Sylvia said that her mom was sleeping with multiple men for only $5. And because of this, Anna came over to the house and beat her up without even checking to see if it was true or not. Gertrude even said that Sylvia called one of her children a whore to get them to come over and beat her. For some reason, Gertrude told her children that Sylvia was a prostitute, and so she got a boy named Ricky Hobbs and her daughter Mary, I believe Mary was 11, she got them to carve "I am a prostitute and proud" into Sylvia's stomach with a hot needle, which I can't even imagine how much that hurt. So Sylvia and Jenny have an older sister named Diana, and she was allowed to visit one time, but during her visit, she gave Sylvia a sandwich, and Gertrude found out, and was completely infuriated, and the next time Diana tried to come over, she was refused at the door. Someone in the neighborhood called a public health nurse to go over to Gertrude's house to check on the girls because they had seen the abuse. And the public health nurse came to the house but never saw Sylvia because she was locked in the basement. So Gertrude took that as an opportunity to say that she had kicked out Sylvia and Jenny and that they were no longer living with her. So the nurse just left thinking that everything was okay, which sucks because that could have been her escape. That could have been Sylvia and Jenny's way of getting out of that house and to safety. And it just didn't happen because the nurse just was not thorough enough, I don't think. That's my opinion, at least. She was not thorough enough. And I don't know where Jenny was at the time. So Jenny might have been in the basement as well, checking on her sister or whatnot. And that's how Gertrude got away with the story, but I'm not sure. A few neighbors had seen what Gertrude was doing to Sylvia, and they just never did anything because they were too afraid of her, which I don't understand. Like, I personally would not care. She's not going to do anything. She's a frail old woman. She's not going to do anything. So I don't know why they didn't just call the police and do something about it. But they didn't, and Jenny didn't say anything to anyone because she was threatened constantly and bullied, and they constantly told her, if you say anything, you're going to get it twice as bad as Sylvia. And Jenny was terrified. Jenny was only about 14 or 15 years old when Sylvia was 16. So, you can imagine not wanting to say anything because you're terrified of these people. The abuse ended up getting so bad that Gertrude eventually told the neighborhood children, if you give me 5 cents, I'll let you do whatever you want to Sylvia. This included sexual assault, burning her, branding the number 3 into her chest, and much more, which is just horrible and disgusting. And I read that and it just made my stomach turn and it made me so angry. But this whole story makes me angry, so. Gertrude at this point knew that Sylvia might not have long to live because of how bad she looked. And she forced Sylvia to write a letter to her parents that she ran away to the forest and met 3 boys there, and that she gave them sexual favors, and they ended up beating and mutilating her. This, of course, we know was not true, but Gertrude made her write that. Gertrude then told her children that she was planning on taking Sylvia to the woods and leaving her there to die. And Sylvia ends up telling Jenny that she's going to die soon and that she knows it. And that's just so sad that she overheard Gertrude saying that and just knew that it was coming, and that she had to tell her little sister that. That's just so sad. Sylvia did try to escape one last time and actually got outside the door, but then Gertrude found her and took her back inside, obviously. That's when Gertrude got a boy named Coy Hubbard, and they took a curtain rod and beat the crap out of her until she fell unconscious. And then they both came back and stomped her head in, which is so horrific. And it hurts my heart so much that Sylvia had to go through that. Unfortunately, the final blow to the head is what killed Sylvia. Gertrude didn't notice that she was dead yet, though, and put her in a hot bathtub and tried washing her off. She thought she was just unconscious, but then she noticed that she wasn't breathing. And she thought she was faking it, so she kept yelling at her, screaming at her, and hitting her. And then Sylvia was just unresponsive, so Gertrude realized that she had passed. It was October 26, 1965, when Sylvia passed. Gertrude ended up calling the police, and she stuck with the story that Sylvia had run into the forest, met 3 boys, they beat her, and Sylvia came home just really beaten and mutilated, and that she tried to put her in the bathtub to clean her, and that's when she passed from her injuries. So part of it's true, but the other half was definitely not. But that's just like Gertrude. Thankfully, Jenny went and whispered into one of the policemen's ears and said, "I'll tell you everything you want to know if you get me out of here." And so they did, and she told them absolutely everything. When they did an autopsy, the actual cause of death was brain hemorrhaging, shock, and starvation. So she, on her own, didn't have long to live. But obviously the beatings that she took made it a lot quicker. And hopefully it was a quick death. Hopefully it was not painful, and it was just swift for Sylvia's sake. So Gertrude and her children, Paula, Stephanie, and John, along with Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard, were arrested for murder. Thank God. Several children were actually arrested for the injuring of a person, but none of them got time because they blamed everything on Gertrude, saying that she forced them into doing what they did to Sylvia. Gertrude would plead not guilty for reason of insanity, but this would be completely ignored. She was found guilty and got life in prison. Unfortunately, she did not get the death penalty, which she really deserved. Instead, she got life in prison. Her daughter, Paula, was given life in prison as well because she got charged with second-degree murder. And Paula actually had just given birth to, I believe, a daughter, but she was on her way to jail. John, Richard, and Coy were all given manslaughter charges, which gave them 2 to 21 years in prison because they were minors, and they actually got parole a few years later. Gertrude spent 20 years in prison because she was very clearly guilty, and the autopsy showed everything that Jenny said to the police, and Sylvia died a slow and painful death over the last few months of her life, which is just horrible, and it makes me so sad. Like I said, I pretty much cried during the research of this case. It was just so horrible and horrendous, and it breaks my heart so much for Sylvia. Both Gertrude and Paula were retried. Gertrude was still found guilty, but Paula got a lesser sentence of manslaughter, so she would only have to do 2 to 21 years. And she actually got out 8 years later and became a school teacher. How insane is that? She became a freaking school teacher. Like, you killed a 16-year-old girl and you became a teacher? That's terrifying. So she eventually got found out because she changed her name when she moved, and they found out about the whole Sylvia thing, and they immediately fired her. They were like, "What the heck are you doing in a school teaching children? You unalived someone." So they immediately were like, "Goodbye, get out of here." So thank goodness that someone tipped off the school, because that's just ridiculous. Gertrude was unfortunately granted parole in 1985 and was freed, which I don't understand how. I will never understand how. She's a murderer, and they just let her go because of good behavior. That's not a good enough reason. I'm sorry, it's not. And Jenny and lots of other people went to the courthouse and protested, but it unfortunately didn't do anything, and Gertrude was released. Thankfully, Gertrude died 5 years later of lung cancer, so she didn't have a lot of free time out of jail. And, you know, I don't wish bad things upon people, but I wish bad things upon Gertrude. So, I hope it wasn't a good time. The three boys, John, Richard, and Coy, only served 2 years in prison each, which is absolutely ridiculous and makes me sick to my stomach that they really got off the hook with only 2 years of prison. That's blasphemy. John became a minister that consoled children of divorced parents, which I think is just, no, it doesn't make any sense. Those people should not be allowed around children, let alone become a minister. Like, that makes my skin crawl. Like, no, that's not right at all. Richard would die of lung cancer 4 years later, I believe, and Coy would continue to have run-ins with the law. As far as Jenny goes, she actually died in 2004 at the age of 54, which I think is really sad. I wanted Jenny to live a longer life because Sylvia didn't get to. So I was really rooting that she would live longer than 54. But she unfortunately did pass. And that is the unfortunate and terrible and horrific story of Sylvia Likens. This story really hurt my heart and just made my whole soul enraged at the injustice of the entire thing. And I really hope that by me telling this story, it gives it some form of justice that Sylvia did not get at all. So thank you for watching today, folks. I really hope to see you next time. And remember, stay curious.